not letting me do it. Great.
Okay.
I think thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to get started. I see some people joining, so we'd like to get started relatively on time so we can end on time. Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining. I know we have people coming from all parts of the world, so thank you. My name is Joe King, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at WinWire Technologies. I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Today's topic is Migrate and Modernize SQL Server to Azure. So over the next 45 minutes or so, our co-presenters are going to walk us through various options to migrate SQL Server workloads to Azure, and they're going to share some best practices to ensure your success. So before I introduce our two presenters, let me just touch on a few housekeeping items. During the webinar, we encourage you to please feel free and post your questions in the Q&A. We love questions, and we've allowed as much as 15, 20 minutes towards the end to get to as many questions as we can. So please feel free to raise the questions while they're on your mind, and we'll get to them towards the end. I also wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded, and we are going to share the recording in the next 24 to 48 hours. Okay, now let me introduce today's speakers. We have Mike Markulis from Microsoft. Mike is an entrepreneurial sales leader at Microsoft. He leads the data and AI specialists in Microsoft's West region, focused specifically on enterprise and high-tech strategic and major accounts. And he is focused on cloud database, analytics, and AI solutions. And we also have Chandra Laux from WinWire. Chandra is the Vice President of Data and Analytics at WinWire, and he heads the practice globally. I don't think most people need to be introduced to Microsoft, but there's probably a few of you who aren't very familiar with WinWire. WinWire is a 16-year-old IT services and consulting company based in Santa Clara, California. We are a Microsoft Solutions partner, and we have been a healthcare and cloud app modernization partner of the year finalist as recently as 2021. And as we like to say, we help companies unleash the power of Azure. So with all that out of the way, I think I want to hand it over to Mike to get us started.
Sure. Thanks, Joe, and hi, everybody. Sorry for my voice. I'm getting a little sick, but I wanted to thank everybody for participating in this important webinar and make a few quick points to start us off. The first point that I wanted to make, and by way of introduction, as Joe said, I'm a sales leader at Microsoft. I've been in this business for a long time. I've been in the database business and worked for several companies since the 90s, Informix, Oracle, and others. And so I've been around for quite a while and understand a lot about migrating databases. And the point that I really want to bring to the fore is that migrating databases, whether those are SQL or other databases, is really a subset of what we're trying to do to transform companies. The hierarchy that we envision at Microsoft and that WinWire embraces with its approach towards customer implementations is that migrations is a means to the end of modernizing companies' data estates. Data estates are comprised of many different databases, both operational and analytic. And if we want to build out a modern data estate, we start with migrating operational data from silos on-prem into the cloud, taking old databases and moving those to newer versions of those so they can be more agile, so they can lower the cost of computing, so they can burst out on demand without having to spend a lot of capital on building out data center infrastructure for peak and instead operate much more efficiently. So what you guys are going to see today, consider that a stepping stone towards building a more modern data architecture for your organizations that will enable businesses to transform and operate more effectively and compete more effectively in this modern data intensive world that we have. Next slide. The journey that we typically see is people move from a siloed, reactive, sort of naive state where everything, excuse me, is operationally dispersed. Nothing is consolidated. People have to report on things that have already happened. There's no predictive capabilities in there. If you want to merge data from, for example, Salesforce and SAP, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to do that. A lot of data harmonization and transformation that needs to occur. And so what we like to do is move people on this spectrum from a reactive to a more predictive and proactive state to enable this transformative state where folks have instant access to data across an enterprise from any operational application, from any analytic application. And in fact, the analytic applications are able to blend data from a number of different operational sources. So the company becomes smarter. It is better able to serve its customers. It's better able to harness the capabilities of its employees. And it really is able to monetize the value of the data. And this is a really crucial point here. When data are locked in silos on-prem, it's impossible to fully monetize that. And so what we're trying to do here is unlock the value as we move towards a more modern estate. And this is exactly what WinWire is in place to do, not only for individual SQL environments, but SQL environments on the whole and other databases, and then moving along sort of a couple of stepping stones to get their customers, you guys, into a more transformative state. So the last slide, by way of introduction, that I wanted to present illustrates this very simply. As we move from left to right in technology maturity, we start with modernizing the operational databases, SQL, Oracle, Postgres, etc. We move those from older versions that are either out of support or are feature deficient into modern versions, certainly in the cloud. In some cases, like with SQL on-prem, there's the ability to implement a hybrid solution. Once the operational databases are modernized, we can look at warehousing and BI and analytics and ML for predictive analytics. And then even, and as some of you are aware, there's a lot being talked about with ChatGPT and OpenAI. There's a lot of artificial intelligence that we can drive deeply into the data layer as well as into the application layer. And it really is more effective to do that once the rest of the components are modernized, because imagine being able to apply AI across an array of data sources, all of which are in a modern repository and instantly available with low latency in the cloud. It becomes much more potent and powerful. So I wanted to turn the presentation over to Chandra. I'll be monitoring the chat. Thank you very much for participating. And over to you, Chandra.
Thank you so much, Mike. And Joe, thank you for the introduction. Team, as you heard from Mike, I think there are various stages that customers go through, especially when they have a legacy data estate. And as you saw him talk about operational applications, there's data warehouses, there's advanced capabilities going from BI to predictive and prescriptive analytics to cognitive services. Data obviously is the foundation of all of these capabilities. A lot of clients have had significant investments in data, either in the form of applications for transactional systems, data warehouses, and going further, data lakes and more. And the consumption patterns have also evolved over the course of so many years. With that being said, I think given the focus of the discussion today, I'll talk a little bit more about our approach, our thought process, the frameworks that WinWire has used to successfully migrate and modernize SQL Server estates to Azure for our clients, and the underlying considerations, because it sounds like a simple problem to solve. Well, I have a SQL Server database. How do I migrate it to Azure? But then what needs to go underneath? What are the planning associated with it? What kind of data points would you need to consider? The complexity assessments, what tools would you use to deliver those capabilities to your clients? I would talk about that the next few slides. The first question is, what is the driver to migrate to Azure? it's almost a no-brainer now, right? I mean, more and more organizations obviously are moving to cloud. There's concepts of scale, there's concepts of performance. All of those drive the decision to migrate to cloud. And as we see that, we also know that customers have spent tremendous number of years and amount of effort to build their application estate on-prem probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when cloud was just starting to kick up. We've seen a lot of time, energy, and effort and estates that people have built on premise. However, as you see the direction forward for the whole, for the world, for the industry, you know that some of these on-prem systems are going to go out of support. So some of the drivers, again, given Microsoft and its positioning in the marketplace, a top cloud provider, some of the reasons why customers should quickly and should start thinking about Azure, if you're not already doing that, would be an unsupported system, an unsupported SQL Server version that you have running in your ecosystem. That's one of your biggest drivers. The others are more aligned with challenges in terms of performance, your ability to scale as your workloads increase and you have more and more data as well as applications that you're adding to your existing estate. And infrastructure that's obviously aging. And with an aging infrastructure comes additional costs, managing those resources, IT services that you're providing, security, audit, regulatory compliance, and so on and so forth. But the most important thing, I keep bringing this up, is the need for innovation. You're seeing innovation move at a rapid speed in the industry, new language models, new AI-based services. As I said, the core of all of that is data, and being able to increase your compute capabilities, increase your storage capabilities much beyond what you've done in the past should be a key driver for you. And those are the drivers that we're seeing in the industry, where we have clients looking at Azure as a potential cloud-based solution for them. At WinWire, we come up with a framework called as Migration as a Service. And our specific service called WinSQL that focuses on migrating our on-prem SQL workloads to Azure is based on this framework. One very important thing to consider here is that a migration framework is not just about the data. There's infrastructure associated with it. There are applications that sit on top of these underlying operational data stores. There's data warehouse-based capabilities that customers have set up. It could be on SQL Server, it could be a typical relational or a fact-dimensional model that has been laid out. There are operational data stores that have been laid out, and then there are collaboration tools that become part of an estate that customers have. What we have defined under the MAS framework is a well-structured methodology for migrating all of these capabilities. It's not just about the data. We have a bunch of automation tools and scripts that we've laid out that are useful and that are helpful to migrate each of these components. An engagement model and a team structure, industry best practices, what's the right thing to do? How do you assess the current state? What kind of scripts do you need to run? What's the migration plan and sequencing? And when you have structure to a problem statement like this, you're more likely than not going to succeed in your efforts to migrate your current workloads. So WinSQL is built on this MAS framework, and it specifically WinSQL focuses on migrating on-prem SQL Server workloads to Azure. We have other similar offerings that focus on Oracle migrations and Teradata migrations to Azure SQL. So when we talk about on-prem SQL Server to Azure, there are three broad migration approaches that are followed. One is a more simple and conventional, I mean, it comes easier to our minds, a lift and shift approach, which I think we've seen a lot of companies adopt. In this case, obviously, the technology stack remains the same, assuming it's a supported version. That is why the feasibility question comes up. The SQL Server database is set up on an Azure VM machine. It's the easiest, when I say the easiest, if it's feasible, as I said, it's the least, in terms of thinking, again, it's the most basic form of migration that you would be able to do when it comes to an IaaS-based lift and shift model. The second approach is more around simplifying and migrating your data estate, your database, your on-prem SQL database. And this involves a couple of options. You typically use an Azure SQL managed instance as an option for this, where you're retaining some of the data structures and data is transferred from the on-prem SQL Server to Azure SQL MI in as-is form. However, I think the Azure SQL MI has certain capabilities. Obviously, it's a managed instance, which means the database is supported, the OS is supported by Microsoft. However, there are certain tools that if, in case you're using some of those, like SQL Server reporting services or SQL Server integration services, those are not supported, and there are alternate ways to run those. The third option is the redesign and migration, which is what we are seeing a lot of our customers also consider, which is migrating to a hosted Azure SQL DB. Here, this follows a very typical cloud native architecture. It helps you relook at your data estate. It helps you relook at your overall application estate and how data is stored underneath. What's the best way to it's modernize your capability and transform and migrate that data from an on-prem system to a cloud-based Azure SQL DB. So 3 very high-level approaches, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what goes into each of these. As I said, when we talked about those first option is SQL Server and VMs. It's an IaaS-based setup and capability that you're enabling. Here, the customer continues to have full control of OS and SQL, which means the same version that you've been running on-prem, assuming it's a supported version, is set up on the Azure cloud. There's full support for all on-prem features. For example, if you're using customized versions of SQL Server reporting services, or you have SSAS that you're running in your on-prem SQL setup, all of those would be supported when it's migrated to a VM-based capability on cloud. A SQL Server managed instance, which is again a PaaS capability. The OS and SQL is managed. Obviously, the servers are managed. It supports pretty much most of the on-prem features. There are certain add-on modules that you would need to consider, for example, SSAS as an additional service, and SSRS in case there are certain SSRS is not available in an Azure MI-based capability, you would have to consider paginated reports or alternate Power BI-based capabilities to address that need that you may have. The third is Azure SQL DB, which is a complete PaaS service. It's a full managed service with operating system and the SQL servers completely managed by Azure. Autoscale, automated backups, all the benefits that you typically get by moving an on-prem capability to a cloud-based system. So, getting one further level down, how difficult can a migration really be? I mean, that's a typical question that I hear, right? I mean, I am in an on-prem setup. I already have my models in place. I have an application sitting, whether it's an operational database or it's an analytical data store. How difficult is it going to be to just migrate my estate? So, as with most on-prem systems that you're trying to migrate to cloud, there are a set of things that you should consider, that you should obviously keep in mind. And some of this is obviously an initial effort that you would have to do to assess what kind of customizations do you have? What are the levels of objects that you have set up within your existing estate? And again, I'll talk a little bit more about how we are accelerating this process. But the things that you typically consider are the schemas, right? The data model, the objects, the code that's underlying that, the level of customizations that have been laid out, the mapping data types. Are there syntax differences? Because your on-prem SQL, assuming you move to an Azure SQL DB, there are some syntax differences between how those are handled in an on-prem setup versus a cloud setup. Any incompatibilities that exist between your on-prem setup and a cloud setup. So schemas become an important part. How is the database stored, structured? The infrastructure, for obvious reasons, again, the DBMS optimization techniques that are being used, the deployment types, the hosting environment, how is that laid out? The core data, and we're talking about a database migration, so the core data, right? What's the process to load that data? Is it an application data store? Is it an operational reporting data store? Is it a data warehouse? How is it modeled? How is data ingested into it? Especially in a data warehouse scenario, you have to take into consideration the ETLs that are associated with it, the load utilities. How's the data backed up? What's the archival process? All of that from a data standpoint is going to be important. In terms of applications, obviously, the interfaces with the data could be code, it could be connectors, syntax, and then other factors such as performance optimization, indexing, and security become important considerations. Some of these you could identify through metadatabase tools, which is what I'll talk about in terms of accelerators. Others, I think you will have to look at information that as you gather and plan for your migration. These are key to determine how you lay out your migration strategy. How do you phase it out? What are the checklists that you would keep at the start of the migration? And you could be migrating a simple schema. There are different layers of complexity and different levels of migration of an on-prem setup to a cloud. People do offline backups, use that backup and migrate and export that data to a cloud instance. Whereas there are others that have a complete ecosystem, a complete data warehouse ecosystem with integrations, with stored procedures, functions, SSIS-based capabilities, the whole integration, the 9 yards of bringing data in from numerous sources, internal and external, storing it into a fact dimensional model, potentially an ODS, a staging layer. So multi-layer data architecture that also needs to be considered. So the complexities are determined by the number of databases, the number of schemas, and the underlying leverage of those within your data estate. So let's talk about the WinSQL. Again, as I said, WinSQL is based on WinWire's mass framework. And the key differentiator is it helps you migrate, but not just migrate. It helps you modernize your data ecosystem. It's not just about migrating an existing data estate onto Azure SQL, but modernizing that capability and bringing in those services. What we bring to the table is well-defined processes, tools, and frameworks to facilitate and enable a seamless migration for you. And these migrations could run a certain period of time. There are smaller migrations, there are larger migrations. In some cases, the whole architecture of how the data flows and how it is managed and stored and so on and so forth, that goes through changes. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. It's not just about migrating data, but it's about migrating, as I said, all the 4 tenets. The data could be based on an application, it could be a data warehouse, it could be collaboration-based tools. When you're moving that estate, there are certain benefits that you can get by using WinWire SQL Go Big migration program. While at that, I would also like to bring up Microsoft's SQL Go Big program. I think one of the things that I'm sure Mike would talk about later on would be how Microsoft's supporting a lot of clients, and there's funding that's available, there's dedicated funding that's available to help customers move their on-premise SQL estate to cloud as well. So just wanted to bring that up, and Mike, maybe you can touch base on that particular topic for a moment towards the end of this, or if you can do it right now, if you would like to.
Well, whatever's convenient for you, Chandra. I don't want to get you off of your off of your stride there, but yeah, we have a significant number of programs. Go Big is one of them. Microsoft is able to dedicate significant investment, both financially as well as in terms of people and resources, to the effort to migrate these databases over. There are lower ROI requirements, and so the money is easier to get. And so work with your local teams to explore that with WinWire. WinWire is one of our preferred partners for this, and so we're very, very happy to engage this worldwide program to make it easier and more affordable for our customers to move these SQL workloads.
Thank you, Mike. And sure. Adding to what Mike just said, WinWire also has its investment. Again, in addition to these tools and accelerators, we invest in getting our customers who have a legacy SQL Server estate to cloud as well. So do talk to WinWire, and you'll have the email IDs that you could reach out to, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Getting into the migration phases, again, as I said, migration is not just a migration. It goes through various phases, and it also depends on where you are as a customer in your Azure journey, right? There are clients who are kicking off this effort purely from an on-prem setup. It's not just about the SQL Server, but they don't have an Azure tenant. They're looking at options to bring in Azure into the mix. And in those cases, the landing zone, which is what's called out here, becomes an important component of moving from your on-prem setup to cloud, to Azure. So envisioning a cloud journey, if you don't have one already, is a key input into how you would envision your SQL Server migration. So that's almost the starting point. Within your cloud journey, your SQL Server infrastructure assessment, your Azure cloud, what you already have as specific instances in case you have some, what kind of ROIs would be generated by migrating individual assets into Azure cloud. Some of those are inputs that you would perform upfront during your envisioning, assessment, and planning efforts. That's typically the first effort. And as I said, as part of that envisioning, if you already have a landing zone, you have the necessary resource groups, you have the tenant in place, you already have a Microsoft rep who's helping you out with all of that. That's typically the starting point. Going from there is the next step of looking at your SQL Server environments, right? And this could be, as I said, applications, it could be collaboration tools, the infrastructure component associated with it. Looking at what are the interfaces, what are the apps that are sitting on SQL Server, what is the priority of migrating or modernizing these workloads to Azure? Do you want to follow a similar or a current architecture for your applications? Is there an opportunity to relook at the architecture that was set up in the past and move to a more modern architecture that that Azure provides? Those are questions that you would want to address. There are certain things that come out of the box. I mean, there's aspects of security and compliance-based requirements that for most corporations, I think native Azure capabilities would provide that when you migrate or move to an Azure-based setup. In other cases, those are also important considerations, especially if you're in a regulated industry, such as healthcare or life sciences. You may want to go beyond or at least understand what it means and then look at different options when you're looking at a cloud-based implementation. At the end of this, you would want to have a well-defined migration strategy and plan. As I said, the considerations that I talked about, the schemas, the interfacing objects, the infrastructure, all of that will drive your migration strategy and plan. The next step, if you don't have a landing zone, if you don't have Azure in your ecosystem, is to obviously get that in place. So you have your landing zone set up. You want to be able to get your core infrastructure in place to enable the migration of your on-prem SQL environment. And that's like a baseline that you'd want to get into. After that, again, based on the assessments of your data and app estate, you would typically want to consider a pilot that you would migrate from your on-prem to a cloud. That could be a specific functional area. It could be a set of databases. It could be a set of applications if it's an operational capability that you're trying to migrate to cloud. You would want to see and ensure that it's seamless for you. That's why I'm saying the intent is to be able to communicate through this process with your stakeholders who leverage this data, who are leveraging these applications and so on and so forth. Once you have a successful pilot, and again, there are ways in which you define a successful pilot. One is the migration, how seamlessly has it been? Is the consumption of data equivalent to what it was when you had an on-prem setup? I mean, the customers who are using the data, do they see anything changing? Obviously, the connections, the login, the consumption patterns could change, and we'll have to create that adoption. But the pilot is typically a good exercise to get them more and more conversant with Azure and how those resources can be consumed. What do you need to keep in mind, right? Practices in terms of the queries that you would run, how autoscale would work, what should you expect as performance considerations, and so on and so forth. Once we have a successful pilot, you typically move towards a rollout and drive adoption across the enterprise. Starting with a function, more likely than not, you'll be looking at a function that would that you would want to migrate from their legacy estate to a more modern data stack. Each area, there's a big recommendation to reconsider a typical lift and shift. I mean, for most of our customers, we tell them to look at a redesign of the architecture and make it more future-proof than you are at this point in time. And also get a lot of feedback from your end users and consumers who would be using or consuming from the application or from the data warehouse or from the data estate that's there. The ability, again, as you redesign this, the ability to start thinking about newer capabilities. It's not just about a SQL Server database anymore. It's about how do you use that? How can you integrate that data with other data sets into a broader a modern data stack? It's going to be important to keep in mind. So looking at it in isolation is not a great idea. Starting to look at it as a redesign effort for the enterprise or for the function and then extending it to the enterprise is going to be critical. Once you do that, obviously you have more and more of your data estate and application estate migrated to your Azure cloud. Then looking at business transformation based initiatives, extending your SQL services, optimizing your costs, another important aspect. I mean, in an on-prem setup, you're paying for certain hardware, you're paying for an infrastructure, you know what the performance is going to be as you keep using and running those queries and managing your applications. In a cloud-based system, it's important to keep a tab of the costs that are associated with the running of your services. There are tools that we'll talk about at a later point in time around cost containment. How do you monitor and track those costs? How can you optimize management of the services cost? That's part of the framework, the SQL Go Big program that we have. So it's not just about migrating, but also how do you monitor, how do you optimize and keep that channel on as you go through this life cycle. So very high level view of the migration phases, but most of our clients that we engage with, we recommend that you go through this process. Customers could have already completed their landing zone effort, which means the higher focus is on SQL Server estate and what do you want to migrate. And again, in some cases, especially in data warehouses, right? We actually recommend a completely modern data platform stack and an architecture moving away from your current state, right? And that enables aspects such as bringing in structured and unstructured data, combining them together into a data lake zone, multiple layers. Again, I'm sure people who are in this world would know about the different layers that you would have, typically a bronze, silver, and gold, or a raw staging and a curated zone. Moving into Synapse for certain workloads. Again, multiple options. I mean, as a legacy, a lot of them could have just stayed with the SQL Server data warehouse and maybe struggling in terms of performance, in terms of self-service, in terms of user interaction and interactivity of queries. A lot of that would obviously change when you consider a more modern data stack and a data platform capability. However, in this particular case, as I said, one of the options is to migrate into a SQL Server database on cloud, on Azure.
Chandra, migration phases that you just laid out there.
Yeah.
Can you give the audience an approximate time frame?
Sure. So the envisioning or the assessment could typically take a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the size of that estate. So the short answer is it depends in terms of the estate that you're trying to modernize or migrate. But a very typical time frame is an assessment of 2 to 3 weeks. The landing zone could be as little as 2 weeks, depending on, as I said, setting up the ecosystem, the infrastructure. It's a quick effort. Could go up to 4 or 6 weeks in case you're doing it across multiple environments and it's not a single instance that you're trying to do it. You're doing it at an enterprise level. You want to make sure that you're setting up the landing zone overall. It's not just for the SQL Server setup. The rollout, again, could range again based on the estate, but usually the pilot and the landing zone 6 weeks, the assessment 2 to 3 weeks. A rollout is the larger ecosystem, and what all do you have in your environment? Is it just application? Is it a whole data warehouse? A data warehouse migration could run anywhere. I mean, it's not just about the volume of the data, but the objects and so on and so forth. It could run anywhere between 12 weeks to around 8 months. So again, three months to 8 months is a typical time frame. And then the ongoing support maintenance is kind of part of hypercare and ongoing support. So I would consider, depending on the size of your estate, approximately anywhere between 3 months to 8 months for this migration, including the assessment and the pilot.
Thank you. Helpful.
Sure. Thank you. So how do you do this migration, right? I mean, why WinWire? Why the WinSQL capability? What is the toolkit that we bring to the table? So most of you who have considered migrations would be familiar with the DMA, the DMS service that's provided by Microsoft. Just doesn't bring, I mean, it helps. It's supposed to aid a migration. We've built our extension of the DMS and DMA to not only help with the migration assessment of the environments, and I talked about the various things that you need to assess, the schema, the integrations, the patterns, and so on and so forth, but also provide that output in a form and shape that's consumable, that gives you a sense of what the estate is, what effort would it take to migrate it, and then getting into the strategy. It's a key input into the strategy. So The assessment results and an interactive visualization-based capability is what we would typically bring in. And we have a tool called WinDMA, which is an extension of the DMS service that's provided by Microsoft. That's used to provide that capability. And then there's a Power BI dashboard that helps you understand what your current test data is. And a lot of times, the teams that do the assessments are not directly associated with the whole application. They're doing it as an external entity. That's why they're looking at the metadata to pull that out to assess complexity and what goes into it, which applications are going to be migrated, and how's the data set up underlying those applications and warehouses. We also have offline migration automation scripts. Primarily, when you're doing, let's say, bulk copy programs, there are certain scripts that you would use to do that. We have scripts to be able to do that, to modernize it, to transfer, to import. We also have a metadata automated ingestion capability in case you move away from a typical ETL process. Let's say that in legacy, you've used SSIS, you have a data warehouse environment, you're moving data from a source system into your SQL Server environment, either a staging area or a data warehouse, a fact dimension-based model, or into a data mart. In the new modern data architecture, you would want to consider or reconsider that architecture. As I said, it's not just migration, but potentially opportunities for modernization. And if you did that, a metadata-based ingestion capability is something that we bring out of the box. You wouldn't, and we can demo that to you, to customers who would be interested, but it's a significant accelerator. And it's also a good practice when you're trying to clean up your whole integration process, because your integration processes have been built over the years. It's a great idea to look at how that can be optimized, that can be redesigned, and also leveraging, as I said, newer tools and capabilities. Azure Data Factory, Synapse pipelines are a big, are a very well accepted and adopted service that we're seeing, especially with customers who have data warehouses on SQL Server and are trying to move away into a more modern data architecture data stack. The third thing is reconciliation. Typically, when you have an existing environment and you have a new environment, reconciliation becomes an important part of the process. And we also have a Power BI-based capability to show those out of the box. We also have the ability to recon the data sets in an automated manner. So those are some of the toolkit capabilities that we bring, especially on the data side. Just want to bring that up as well. So before I talk about a couple of user scenarios, wanted to provide a quick overview of what we spoke and what's the value proposition here. So obviously, the effort is not just a typical migration effort. I would strongly, and I'm sure Mike had talked about it up front, I would strongly recommend that you don't consider just a migration as a migration. Think about options to redesign. Look at options to modernize your stack. Look at options to improve the way you're processing data, whether it's an application database or it's a data warehouse. In terms of our capability, I think, as I said, we have a metadata-driven automated assessment and precision roadmap definition that'll help you get to your state, define that strategy for you. A cloud adoption framework-enabled migration to Azure service covers all of the capabilities. It's not just about the data, the network, the security, the application, and the data, all of that. We would make this available for you from an on-prem to an accelerated cloud-based setup. And I think I gave you a typical time frame. Some of that could get accelerated if the analysis can be done quicker. If we can run that utility within your organization, we can pull out the metadata. We're in a better position to assess and give you a migration strategy even upfront, as early as an assessment, even prior to a detailed assessment phase. And then obviously we want to help customers adopt. As I said, it's not just about the migration, but about adoption. How do your stakeholders adopt to the newer environment? Are they comfortable? Are there changes in features, especially when you come to a PaaS database versus an on-prem setup? What changes are they seeing? Their consumption entities, how is that impacted? I was running a report against a SQL Server database. I now have an Azure SQL DB. I was running it with SQL Server reporting services. Now I have Power BI. How does that change my interaction with the data? How does that change my experience with the data that's there and with the tools that are being used? So things to consider as we go through this. And WinSQL obviously helps you get there. I think it reduces the migration risk. Our intent is to reduce your overall migration timeframe with acceleration. it's not about just the database. I've said that a couple of times in the past. It's about the estate. It's about the integrations. It's about the application. It's about the reporting. It's about the downstream impact. All of that become part of the migration. And that's why it's not a simple DB export and a DB load. It's much more than that. It's about the processes that drive the database to what it does at this point in time. So we provide optimized data extraction, transfers, and integrated data reconciliation processes, as I said, as part of the tools and utilities. So that's the broad summary value proposition from WinWire. And Microsoft, as I said, has a significant investment in the SQL big program. So you should consider, if you have a legacy data warehouse or a database that's on SQL Server, you should leverage some of the funding that is available through multiple programs that Mike talked about. Our SQL Server migration assessment is on the Azure Marketplace. You can go look it up. It talks about a 4-week effort. As I said, could be 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the complexity of your estate in terms of how we would do it. What are the steps that we would typically take? And again, as I said, some of this could be our investment into the relationship that we build with clients as you're driving this capability for you. In terms of some of the clients, again, this particular customer that I brought up is a large ISV. They're a software firm and a complete on-prem SQL Server shop, right? Very large data estate, primarily application databases with different tenants having their own database stored in their applications and an ERP-based capability. We applied our migration as a service and a SQL Server migration methodology. This is more of a lift and shift, given the size, the volume, and the number of SQL Server instances. The first step for them, again, and customers go through multiple steps. A lot of times it's about, let me get to the cloud first, and then let's talk about how can I redesign, how can I modernize the stack. So in this particular case, the first step was to migrate them. And the approach that was chosen, mutually decided as part of the strategy, was to migrate following a lift and shift approach. And the initial ROI was obviously infrastructure costs and reduction of those costs by almost 30%. That effort has been completed. We are now in the process of talking to them and exploring ways to redesign the migration so that it's not just the good thing is they're on Azure Cloud right now, right? That takes one of those things out of their way. They're no longer challenged through support and their concerns from their end customers and the likes. But we are starting to talk about how we can extend that business value. How can we start looking at redesigning some of those estates? How do we consider a PaaS-based? And the approach there, again, going beyond the initial migration and modernization, is to look at individual data estates, prioritize those, look at differences in features between an IaaS model and a SQL PaaS model, and then going from there. So that's a good case study that I want to bring up. Another one, obviously, is, again, virtualized workloads to Azure Cloud for an electronics company, and I'm close on time. So just want to also bring this up. This is another one where we've helped the client migrate their existing on-premise virtualized workloads to Azure. Hybrid solution. Some of those components are SQL databases, some of it on IaaS, but the larger ecosystem. This, I think, primarily calls out not just the database, but obviously we have the media services that are being used, the integration with on-premise and cloud applications, a little bit of a hybrid architecture for this particular company, again, driven as a SQL Server migration, but again, which is hosted on-premise. And then we migrated them to the cloud, but it's not just a SQL Server database, but their media services. I'm using media services as well, Azure media services, and a hybrid solution that covers the stack, the application stack, the data stack, and so on and so forth for this particular customer. Done, again, an ongoing process post-migration. There's modernization opportunities, new productivity improvements in areas that we're trying to focus on. So with that said, I think, Joe, I would hand it over to you. I think I'm right on time, I believe.
Yeah, no, right on time. So thank you, Chandra. Thank you, Mike. This is great. We have plenty of time for questions. And while I do a shameless plug for our next webinar, please, any questions, raise it in the Q&A tab. We'll get to those in a second. But just wanted to mention, if you've been interested in some of the content that Mike and Chandra have shared today, we are planning a series of webinars with Microsoft through the rest of the year. Our next one will be later in June, probably second half of June, and it'll be on Azure OpenAI services. So we'll keep you posted on that. Until then, you guys ready to take some questions?
Good.
Absolutely.
Don't sound so excited, Mike and Chandra.
Santosh asked a question in the chat here regarding, are there any constraints that we should be aware of? And I'm curious as to whether or not those are technical or economic, what kind of constraints that he might be referring to.
Yeah, he's not seeing the QA tab. He's hence asking the question here. Yeah, are there any constraints that we should be aware of?
Yeah,
you can leave your question there if you can't find the Q&A. Some people have found the Q&A, so we can, I guess, take questions and be flexible and take them in both places.
So I'll kick this off, and Chandra, you can
Sure.
keep me honest and provide more technical detail. In most cases, when we're moving on-prem SQL implementations to the cloud, there's a fairly set number of tools that makes the migration relatively seamless. There's very few schema incompatibilities. There are some features that are missing from earlier versions that are available in later versions. So for all intents and purposes, the DMA tool helps identify the compatibility issues and enable a smooth migration. The only cases where we do have some constraints is really whether the schema objects themselves provide some level of difficulty in terms of migrating. But those are oftentimes very minimal, and they only show up in a very small number of a sample. Most of the time, the schemas migrate effortlessly because of the compatibility between older versions of T-SQL and the newer versions that are available on-prem. SQL MI specifically is designed to enable a very easy and efficient migration, whereas Azure SQL Database is more or less reserved for newer database implementations, not migrating existing systems. I don't know, Chandra, if you wanted to add anything to that.
So, I mean, 100% aligned, right? So there are certain objects, right? I mean, we got to keep in mind that SQL Server has evolved. So it depends on the SQL Server version, on-prem SQL Server version that you have. There are specific objects that have been part of SQL Server, and some of those may be managed or handled differently, let's say in an Azure SQL setup. So I agree. The MI is obviously more and more like your current database setup, but if you're modernizing to an Azure SQL or a complete PaaS service, not an MI service, then there are specific things that you would want to consider. In terms of the actual migration per se, again, going back to that, right? You would want to, as part of the initial assessment that I was talking about, you would also have, if you use WinSQL and that assessment, you would have a mapping of objects that would directly map back to a Azure SQL setup, and others that may or may not. And what's the workaround? I think there are workarounds associated with that. A third component, since you talked about constraints, as I said, a managed instance doesn't necessarily support SSIS or SSRS. So the database constraints won't exist, but then your integration challenges are slightly different. So again, you'd want to take it on a case-by-case basis and then determine what's the best approach for you. But it's typically between an MI and an Azure SQL, though the recommendation is to eventually move into a SQL database, even if it means changing some of your current ways of processing data.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Another question from Alec Herman regarding Azure versus AWS EC2 for hosting SQL. I'm going to speak just briefly about some of the financials and some performance benchmarks, and then maybe also turn it over to Chandra. Because we own the Azure infrastructure, we're actually able to offer some financial incentives, not only the ones that we talked about regarding investing in the migration services, et cetera. Amazon also has similar kinds of investments. But what we offer that Amazon doesn't are two critical things. Number one is in terms of their RDS offering, where they're offering you a version of SQL that you license through Amazon, it's not the current version. And so they're always a couple of versions behind what we're able to implement on within Azure for Azure SQL MI as well as Azure SQL Database. And so, even if you're using RDS and then implementing in Amazon, the actual version is older. The second and perhaps more important issue to consider is that Microsoft offers a 4-to-1 core ratio advantage when moving from on-prem into Azure for general purpose workloads. What that means is if you're currently licensing 1,000 cores on-prem, you're actually able to implement those at no additional cost for 4,000 cores in Azure. Essentially, the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, AHUB benefit, provides a 4-to-1 multiplier for all of the cores that you're using for general purpose in the cloud. And so there's an enormous advantage cost-wise for moving your SQL on-prem workloads into Azure because Amazon doesn't offer that same sort of core multiplier. And so combined with some of the other benchmarks and the version compatibility issue, really the biggest advantage on the financial side is being able to take advantage of this 4-to-1 core ratio multiplier. There are other things like being able to run both on-prem and in the cloud at the same time for a period of time while you're managing migrations, et cetera. But that's maybe some stuff we could talk about separately. Chandra, did you want to add anything on the competitive front versus Amazon?
So again, at the core of it, again, if you have a SQL Server installed and you're thinking about SQL Server, you typically look at Microsoft as your chosen provider. Now, if you already have AWS as a cloud and you have EC2, the options for migration, as I said, there are 3 different options that I laid out, the lift and shift, more from a technical standpoint. Right? There's a lift and shift, there's a redesign option, and a rebuild option. So the modernization option could potentially work because then you're looking at a different stack. You're looking at either the application or the data warehouse. But if you're thinking about a migration from a SQL on-prem SQL Server to an AWS-based cloud stack, I would think the lift and shift is probably your only or more potential option that you would consider as you go through this. With Microsoft, as I said, the options are broader. The DMA, DMS services help you modernize. We can help you migrate more seamlessly, both from an experience standpoint, compatibility standpoint. There's significantly more benefits that you would have when you're migrating to Microsoft stack. So again, other than the commercial considerations, I think even technology-wise, I think given that it's SQL Server is a Microsoft product, there's more seamless support when you're migrating to an Azure stack. That's my 2 cents.
Great, thanks, Chandra. I'm gonna answer Min's question directly. Min Kao had asked whether or not we have consulting services that are available to assist with their architects to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And of course, WinWire is a services company that provides a lot of expertise and has people on the ground to work directly with your folks at your customer site to do these migrations. Microsoft also has a number of resources, not necessarily that compete with, but that can complement what WinWire brings to the table. We have cloud solution architects, we have GBBs, we have global black belts. We have other types of internal resources, SQL ninjas, et cetera, that are zero cost to the customer and can supplement whatever talents Chandra and the WinWire team bring to the table. So that's actually that's a very straightforward answer. Definitely yes, in terms of folks that can work with your people. Sini, I think, has a question regarding how to migrate a highly transactional, low latency database, which can't afford high downtime. And so what I wanted to do, I'll let Chandra answer the bulk of this, but there are a number of ways to manage a migration so as to minimize the amount of downtime when we cut over from the on-prem system to the Azure system. But I think there's another part of this answer that speaks to the efficacy of the database implementations in the cloud, where not only is it very, very low downtime, but also extremely easy to fail over with minimal downtime or sometimes near zero downtime because of the failover architectures that we provide in Azure. So Chandra, I don't know how you manage that last mile and migrating from on-prem to Azure with that go live period. Maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. So as I said, it's when you migrate workloads, you're also prioritizing the workloads, and you have opportunities to run both of them more likely than not before a complete cutover. There are live migrations that are done, but more often than not, when you're doing low latency application workload migrations, the planning becomes very critical because you have a very short cut down or a cutoff window when you have to migrate. And that's why a phased migration, when we talk about, let's say an application has a certain underlying database, you want to migrate the application along with the database, the planning, the evaluation, that process of assessment becomes critical. And that's an important input because there's no simple answer to this. And then the automation tools, which eliminate your manual interventions, especially when you're validating and you're ready to cut over, I think those become important when you're once you reconcile, you have a go ahead. You could do that. Live migration techniques, such as, let's say, database replication, application mirroring, also allow some of those capabilities. But again, it's on a case-to-case basis that I would address this particular problem. And we can talk a little bit more specific to a use case that you have for an application that's very low on downtime. So.
All right, cool. I'm in the middle of answering a question on the chat, so if somebody else could read the next question, that would be great.
I am looking to see if there are any unanswered questions, guys.
I'm answering the Oracle one, so you don't have to read that one out.
Okay.
So I'll also answer the Oracle one. Again, we're actually doing a fairly large Oracle migration. We are currently in the process of doing it. We've done some in the past. Different nuances. You probably saw DMA and DMS. There's SSMA and a corresponding technology that we have. I think, Joe, we should plan a webinar at some point in time in terms of migrating an on-prem Oracle and how do you migrate that to cloud. And again, Oracle has either the Exadata version or the Oracle OCI version or the Oracle on-premise database version. We can go through all of that with interested participants at that point in time.
You're getting thumbs up, so it sounds like a good idea.
Yep. Yeah, let me speak to the Oracle thing real quick. So Oracle has some proprietary technologies like RAC for clustering, which Microsoft doesn't support, and Oracle actually doesn't support that implementation in anything other than its cloud. And so if you want to get rid of Oracle completely, you can migrate to SQL or to Postgres or what have you and re-architect around those HA or load balancing solutions. That's an option. But if you want to move Oracle simply in an IaaS version into Azure, that's a very straightforward motion. And there are those that just want to get rid of Oracle because it's expensive or they don't want to be contractually obligated anymore. And that's a different scenario than folks who simply want to move their existing on-prem Oracle into a cloud environment like Azure. But also then you have a number of choices between Amazon and Oracle's OCI, for example. So it's very, very situational, the kinds of things that we do with Oracle, depending upon the complexity of the application. Sometimes there's application level dependencies. Certain applications work with Oracle, they don't work with SQL. They might not be certified with Postgres. So we really need to go through some due diligence to understand the technology environment that we're dealing with before making a set of recommendations. There are a number of options, and we've done this many, many times as WinWire.
Yeah. I think we're going to end there, guys. We're at the top of the hour, and we've had everyone fully engaged for the full time together, but people are going to start dropping. I want to thank you, guys. We've put our contact information in the chat. In case there is a question that comes to mind after this, feel free to reach out to Mike, Chandra, me. I will get the questions answered for you. And we really appreciate everybody's time today.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all
everyone.
for joining.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye now.